I'll just get right into it. So first, I'll start with the introduction, kind of introduce some of the basic ideas before jumping into some of the research discussion itself. So tetrapods, the limbed vertebrates, don't really need introduction. You can find them pretty much everywhere on Earth, across a huge range of body sizes, ecologies, thousands and thousands of species. It's very easy to just go online and find pictures of them looking majestic in various backgrounds. And this all traces back over an extremely rich and interesting evolutionary history, back approximately 370 million years into the Devonian period. So we start off with these much more unassuming, much more sort of obligatory fishy looking forms. And what I'm particularly interested in is the interaction between diversity change, between morphological change at the anatomical level, the level of individuals, diversity change at the lineage level, the clade level, and then ecosystem change during the earliest parts of the evolutionary history of tetrapods. So specifically for this talk, this traces back to some very old ideas in sort of early tetrapod research, particularly those laid out by E.C. Olson around the middle of the last century. And so he was primarily interested in the origin of mammals during the late Carboniferous and early Permian periods and how that fit into the evolution of terrestrial vertebrate communities. So when he was looking at his fossil assemblages from the early Permian, a little bit from late Carboniferous, he noted that they aren't structured like terrestrial vertebrate communities that we're used to today. We have land plants, of course, but in terms of herbivores, the great bulk of the terrestrial herbivory is being done by arthropods rather than vertebrates. There are some terrestrial vertebrate herbivores, but they're much less numerous and they're not nearly as diverse. Instead, we have essentially a much more top-heavy setup where we have a lot of semi-aquatic and terrestrial vertebrates that are feeding on each other, and they're also relying very much on feeding on aquatic vertebrates, which are themselves fundamentally being fueled by aquatic plants. So this is a terrestrial community that is very strongly dependent on aquatic resources, on aquatic energy input. And of course, it's being populated by these much more reptile-like early members of the mammal lineage. By contrast, when we move into the late Permian, we have a much greater diversity and abundance of these terrestrial vertebrate herbivores, creating a distribution something similar to like what we would have today, where we have a lot of herbivores forming the base of the terrestrial ecosystem, vertebrate herbivores, and then a much smaller number of terrestrial vertebrate carnivores preying on those. And sort of across these two major ecological groupings, we of course have much more derived members of the mammal lineage, many of whom persist through the end period mass extinction into the Triassic period. So one of the things that I think is really interesting about sort of Olson's theories and hypotheses is that he wasn't just thinking about these assemblages as groups of animals or even representatives of lineages of animals, but also as sets of interactions, which are essentially creating an evolutionary environment that is influenced by its components, but has specific properties beyond those. Of course, like I said, Olson is working essentially at the Pennsylvania Permian transition about 300 million years ago, and that's about 70 million years after the origin of limbed tetrapods, and approximately 60 million years after the origin of terrestrial tetrapods. So there's a whole bunch of tetrapod evolution that's happening before Olson really picks with magnifying glass. So the question is, what kinds of community transformation do we see in terms of ecological relationships, and how does that relate to taxonomic composition, how does that relate to anatomical diversity? So part one, the Devonian mass extinction, and how it kind of relates to this very first initial burst of tetrapod diversity. So we know from research on both vertebrates and invertebrates that mass extinctions have major effects not only on lineage diversity, but also on the composition and structure of ecological communities. This is particularly important because very soon after the origin of limbed tetrapods, at the end of the Devonian period, we have the end-Devonian mass extinction. This is a major vertebrate mass extinction, one of the big five for vertebrates, and it's really in the aftermath of this mass extinction that we get the fundamental roots of what we call the modern vertebrate biota, where the dominant vertebrate groups are the actinopteridians, the ray-finned fishes, chondrichthyans, the cartilaginous fishes, and of course, tetrapods, the limbed vertebrates. Okay. Of course, like I mentioned, excuse me, there's quite a bit of tetrapod evolution that's happening even within this rather restricted interval. And in particular, I want to point out that the first terrestrial tetrapods actually show up fairly late in the game, within this time span. They show up about 35 million years after the first limbed tetrapods and 50 million years after terrestrial arthropods. So when tetrapods finally get on land, they aren't emerging into an empty world. It's a world that's already occupied, that's been occupied for tens of millions of years. Excuse me. And on the other side of things, there's quite a strong record of aquatic tetrapod communities during the same time. So with regard to the end-Devonian mass extinction, I'll be essentially looking at four key questions first. One, did the end-Devonian mass extinction cause a change in the structure of ecosystems? Two, did the arrival of terrestrial tetrapods change terrestrial ecosystems? Because of course, like I said, they're slotting into existing terrestrial ecosystems. Third, did the extinction decrease the resilience of ecosystems? This is one of the things that seems to be emerging from paleoecological research, that, excuse me, the ecological communities that we see immediately after mass extinctions are much more unstable. They're much more prone to collapse. Species within them are at much higher risk of extinction. So we might expect that to be the case after the end-Devonian mass extinction. And four, do the addition of terrestrial tetrapods make terrestrial ecosystems more resilient? Another finding that we've had is that the addition of more species generally increases the resilience of an ecosystem, reduces the per species risk of extinction. Also, in particular, terrestrial tetrapods are both providing a new food source and exploiting a new food source in the other arthropods. So by building more of these interactions, it's possible that this increased the resilience of terrestrial ecosystems and helped with their proliferation and eventual success. So for this data set, I looked at 14 localities, tried to get a roughly even number of marine and non-marine principally from the late Devonian through the end of the Mississippian or early Carboniferous. Added in two localities, the terrestrial arthropod Gilboa locality from the middle Devonian, the Grecian, and then the estuarine Maguasha locality from Quebec, from the Fronian, which is early late Devonian. So just briefly talking about the methods that I use. So in order to talk about ecosystems, the approach I take is based on guilds. And so a guild is described as a group of species with the same prey and predators. This allows us to define a set of potential feeding interactions. And if it sounds broad, that's because it is, which is good, because it allows us to compare a whole bunch of taxa that are anatomically and physiologically quite different. So guilds are based on 3 variables, and we'll use this lovely tetrapod, L. desion, as an example. So first, habit, where does it live? So looking at Aldesion, we can see a lack of sensory canals, ossified carpals and tarsals, so we have bones in the wrist and ankle. And looking at the geological evidence, it's preserved during a toxic water interval in which aquatic life in the lake would have been impossible. So we can infer that this is a terrestrial animal. Second, diet. What does it eat? This is often fairly straightforward because there doesn't tend to be a lot of dietary diversity in early tetrapods at this time. So we can see sharp conical teeth and infer that this is a faunivore, it's eating other animals. And size, how big is it? The specimen that's preserved is about 15 centimeters, and from there we can estimate about 30 centimeters total body length, and so we can put that in a size category. This is small on my scale, and then together we have Aldesion, and we can put it into the small terrestrial faunivore guild. So starting off with questions 1 and 2, did the extinction cause ecosystem change? And did the arrival of terrestrial tetrapods cause ecosystem change? And to look at this, I first started off with some ordinations of taxonomic composition separated by time. Excuse me. So if we first look at the vertebrate diversity alone, we see pretty strong separation between the Devonian and Mississippian localities, and also for slightly different reasons between the non-marine and marine localities. However, when we add in the invertebrate diversity, so we're looking at everything, the separation between the Mississippian and Devonian convex hulls shrinks greatly, but it's maintained in the environmental grouping. So this indicates that, environment seems to be, a really strong discriminant in terms of taxonomic composition, less so to a certain extent than time. So if we look at gild richness, we actually have overlap between the Mississippian and Devonian convex hulls, and very, very reduced separation between marine and non-marine. This suggests that in terms of gild richness versus taxonomic composition, we're getting a lot more change, a lot more separation in taxonomic composition than we are in terms of gild richness. That's to say, which guilds are present versus absent, and the proportion of species that are present in those guilds. So looking at questions 3 and 4, did the extinction decrease resilience of terrestrial ecosystems? And 4, did the addition of terrestrial tetrapods make terrestrial ecosystems more resilient? So for this, I use the cascading extinctions on graphs, or KEG model developed by Peter Rootmarine, which I will briefly explain. So step 1 is to create a meta network. This is taking the guilds that we made earlier and linking them based on their potential feeding relationships. So here the arrows point from the prey guild to the predator guild. So we have an arrow from plants to herbivores, and then from herbivores to faunivores, from faunivores to larger faunivores, so on. Step 2 is to create a species level network. This is when the computer takes over. So it creates a species level network that is congruent with the meta network. So this is essentially taking the guilds that are linked by all potential feeding relationships and then choosing a distinct set of feeding relationships between individual species. Then step 3, we have the perturbation. So when we perturb the species level network, we remove some amount of primary productivity. The amount removed is the perturbation. So here we've removed 5 units of plants. And then 4 is secondary extinction. This is the amount of consumer species extinction in response to the perturbation. So you can see here, because we've removed 5 units of plants, there are 4 species that went extinct because they couldn't be supported. And due to that extinction, the pattern of feeding relationships in a species level network has changed. So we do that many, many, many times over, going for the full range of perturbation from 0 to 100%, and recording these secondary extinctions at each step. And we end up with a graph like this, where perturbation is on the x-axis, secondary extinction is on the y. You can see that at low levels of perturbation, we have very low levels of secondary extinction, and then at approximately 55–60% perturbation, we suddenly jump to getting much higher levels of secondary extinction, up to and including total collapse. So doing this procedure across the data set, you can see that while there are some variations, we generally have a very similar response pattern across all these localities, across environment and across time, where from about 0 to 50% perturbation, we have low levels of secondary extinction with very low variance. And then at about 55–65%, we jump to a low variance but very high secondary extinction regime. Now, I've highlighted two localities here, Gilboa in the Devonian and East Kirkton in the Mississippian, because these are the two terrestrial localities in the data set. So on the left, we have the Middle Devonian invertebrates only, and on the right, we have the Mississippian invertebrates and the first terrestrial vertebrates. And you can see that we again have similar response curves. The dots are a bit funny in the pattern because these are quite low diversity localities, so they're really kind of scraping the lower limit for species counts that the model can mathematically analyze while avoiding size effects. But you can see that we still have the large increase at slightly below 50% perturbation, and we get the progressive start of the collapse at about 60% perturbation across both. So this is really interesting because you can see here, if we look at the meta-networks for both of these localities, East Kirkton is much more complex. It's relatively low diversity, but it has essentially a greater variety of species. But looking more broadly across Devonian localities where there's at least some onshore component, usually some arthropods on the riverbank or on the lakeshore, while there are all aquatic vertebrates preserved, it's actually only a very small proportion of gill richness at East Kirkton that is novel. And it's not that we're getting terrestrial faunivores for the first time, it's that we're getting slightly larger ones. And these include not only tetrapods, but also arthropods, particularly scorpions, which have been terrestrial and feeding on other terrestrial arthropods for millions of years at this point. So while East Kirkton seems very different, if you do a point-to-point comparison, there is actually surprisingly little innovation, and this is innovation driven by an increase in body size, which itself isn't unique to tetrapods. So, findings from part one. Question one, did the extinction cause ecosystem change? No. We have substantial differences in taxonomic diversity versus what it seems like continuity in terms of gill diversity and gill richness. Two, did the extinction decrease the resilience of ecosystems? No clear evidence of that. Devonian and Mississippian communities show similar perturbation responses. Three, did the arrival of terrestrial tetrapods change terrestrial ecosystems? No, with a star. Tetrapods are a minimal functional addition. They slot into existing faunivore guilds, and such the members of new guilds, these guilds are also being occupied by arthropods at the same time. And four, did the addition of terrestrial tetrapods make terrestrial ecosystems more resilient? Again, no. Gilboa and East Kirkton show similar perturbation responses. Which kind of raises the question, tetrapod terrestrialization is a big deal for the tetrapod lineage, but in terms of ecosystem impacts, is it new, but perhaps not novel, in the sense that it represents tetrapods moving into a new environment to a certain extent, but not doing anything new there. They're still eating other animals, much like they have been in the water and would continue to do for millions of years. And this is particularly interesting because East Kirkton, despite decades of searching, does still seem to be the oldest terrestrial tetrapod locality that we can find, but it's the only one of its kind at the time. And afterwards, there's about 20 million years in terms of terrestrial tetrapods where we have a gap before they reappear at Joggins in the early Pennsylvanian. And in this intervening time, temnospondyls take a fossil record hiatus, and thracosaurids, which are sort of amniote-aligned group that make up most of the diversity at East Kirkton, they disappear completely. Microsaurs seem to persist, but then this gets into the thorny question of what actually is a microsaur. And on the flip side, we have the origination of crown amniotes somewhere in the span, big radiation of microsaurs somewhere in the span, and terrestrial temnospondyls reappear at East Kirkton. So somewhere in this intervening 20 million years, a lot is happening, and there's not a lot that's carrying forward from East Kirkton to Joggins. Raising the question of, well, East Kirkton is a first, but maybe it's not the first in terms of models of terrestrial vertebrate communities that carry forward into the fossil record. And maybe it's in the Pennsylvanian, particularly at Joggins, that we're getting a community that looks a bit more normal, or at least is going to be built on by successive terrestrial tetrapods. So that leads us, I think, naturally into part 2, the Pennsylvanian. Water. Right, so I've talked a lot about the Mississippian so far. This is the early Carboniferous, and then the late Carboniferous, the Pennsylvanian period, runs from about 223 million years ago to 299 million years ago. And of course, this opens up a similar set of questions. How are the vertebrate communities, particularly tetrapod communities, coming together in terms of their taxonomic composition, in terms of the ecological structure? How are these things responding to perturbation, and how do these perturbation responses line up with the changes in lineage diversity, taxonomic composition that we know are happening through the Pennsylvanian? Excuse me, in particular, at what point do we start to get some kind of differentiation in ecological structure, in ecological responses from the Mississippian, which seems in a lot of ways to be a continuation of the same old from the Devonian. So I start off first by just kind of quantitatively trying to chart tetrapod diversity throughout the entire Carboniferous in North America. So today set about 41 localities. I broke them up into 3 a priori by geographic regions: the Atlantic, which is pretty much all Canadian, the Midwest, which you can see here with the diamonds, and then the Southwest with the stars. So in terms of paleogeography, we're essentially in the very low paleo latitudes, very close to the equator. Throughout much of this time, a lot of these localities are going to be, if not coastal, then pretty low lying, warm, wet. Although as the Pennsylvania progresses, due to the late Paleozoic Ice Age, we have increasing aridity and seasonality. So these are some of the results of the graphing. You can see just at a glance that as we go through time, from Mississippian on the left to the Toronto, Pennsylvania on the right, we have some groups start off being very high proportion of diversity and then crash later on. Other groups have the opposite fate. And looking at gill richness on the right, we can see that we start off in the Mississippian with essentially all tetrapods being aquatic faunivores, over 80%. And then in the Pennsylvanian, we certainly get changes. We get terrestrial faunivores coming in a big way. But it's only toward the very end that we start to get noticeable numbers proportionally of terrestrial tetrapod herbivores. So doing another NMDS ordination, looking at how localities sort an ordination space, first based on their taxonomic composition on the left and their gild richness on the right. We can see that we have a lot of separation between convex hulls based on taxonomic composition, where on the left we have the Mississippian very strongly separated from the late Pennsylvanian, the blue and the purple representing the Casimovian, and the Muscovian green kind of bridging the gap between the early Pennsylvanian, the Bashkirian, the late Pennsylvanian, and then the early Pennsylvanian itself kind of straddling the gap between the Mississippian and the middle and late Pennsylvanian. We get much less separation when we look at gild richness on the right, again, across time. And kind of the upshot of this was that I found that time seemed to have a much stronger discriminating effect than geography. This ordination repeated using geographic region as separation. There's way more overlap. So we essentially have three tetrapod faunas throughout the Carboniferous. In the Mississippian, like I said, we have almost exclusively aquatic faunivores. Diversity at each site is very low. You're usually only getting 2 to 3, maybe 4 species of tetrapod at each locality. Taxonomically, these are almost invariably clostiids and abolomirs. It's almost comical, essentially, of kind of rubber stamped across the landscape. Very rarely do you have wachirids and then these spots of microsaurs. Environmentally, we have ongoing sea level fluctuation throughout the Mississippian after the end-Devonian mass extinction. In the early Pennsylvanian, we have lots of terrestrial faunivores. These are predominantly microsaurs. We have multiple Lagerstätten, of which Joggins is one. And taxonomically, again, it's a lot of what we call levispondal tetrapods. So again, microsaurs, we have lots of nitridians. In the water, the dominant predators are embolomirs, likely stem amniotes, kind of, think crocodile analogs. And we have the late Paleozoic Ice Age in full swing. So we've got the cyclothems and coal swamps developing with these regular changes in sea level. In the late Pennsylvanian, however, we start to move more towards something more modern, particularly more amniote dominated. We have terrestrial herbivores that are widespread on the landscape in terms of the geographic distribution, but they're very low diversity. You're usually only getting, 1 or 2 species per locality, if that. And particularly in the terminal Pennsylvanian, it's almost always Adaptosaurus. At each site, though, total diversity has increased, particularly relative to the Mississippian. And taxonomically, we have lots and lots of synapsids, so mammal line tetrapods, and temnospondyls, particularly temnospondyls more adapted for terrestrial or semi-aquatic activity. Environmentally, again, we have the late Paleozoic Ice Age intensifying, and it's bringing increasing seasonality and increasing aridity. Pangaeas coming together. So from part 2, we seem to have taxonomically distinct faunas through these different phases of the Carboniferous. In particular, we have essentially a synapsid take over the late Pennsylvanian, particularly in the latest part of the late Pennsylvanian, which is then carried forward with minimal disruption into the early Permian. Terrestrial herbivores do show up, but they show up quite long after terrestrial faunivores, and even within kind of more constrained phylogenetic samplings, we're getting herbivorous synapsids quite long after we've had, terrestrial faunivorous synapsids. Which of course raises the question of when does the decoupling of terrestrial communities from aquatic resources really begin? And that brings us to part 3, the early late Pennsylvanian transition in Atlantic Canada. So if you were very, very sharp-eyed, you might have noticed that Joggins, early Pennsylvanian, and the City Mines Formation, latest early Pennsylvanian, sort of middle Pennsylvanian, they do plot out in different parts of the ordination space. In particular, Joggins, between sort of the 3 different assemblages, kind of straddles the Mississippian, which is very much, all about aquatic tetrapods, and the rest of the early Pennsylvanian, where we are getting these terrestrial tetrapods, but they're overwhelmingly faunivores. Whereas, if you'll notice, the City Mines Formation, includes Florence, is plotting very strongly with late Pennsylvania localities, particularly those from the Gazelian, which is the terminal Pennsylvanian. And you can see here on the right, looking at the correspondence analysis, looking at how essentially different taxonomic groups are driving the distribution of localities in ordination space. You can see that Florence and Joggins are, again, in different parts of the ordination space. They're composed of different taxa. In particular, the City Mines Formation, Florence, seems to be composed of a much more late Pennsylvanian mix of tetrapods. So this seems to paint a quite interesting scenario where at Joggins we have a fairly typical early Pennsylvanian tetrapod assemblage alongside what seems to be an early Pennsylvanian flora, whereas the City Mines Formation has a middle Pennsylvanian flora, it seems, or at least is happening at the same time as where these middle Pennsylvanian floras, but we're getting this late Pennsylvanian tetrapod mix. So it seems that the tetrapods are preceding the flora in terms of what we expect at different points in the Pennsylvanian, which I thought was really interesting. So what I'm working on right now is trying to model the Joggins and City Mines Formation, model their paleo communities, and hopefully with help of some collaborators, particularly the Madden Lab, adding in at least some of that floral component to see essentially how the floras match up, and if the floras can help us constrain the role of some of those ecosystem components. Because one thing that I've run into is that, particularly the City Mines Formation, it's notable who's not showing up, or at the very least, I've had a lot of difficulty finding literature written about. So we have aquatic tetrapods in the City Mines Formation. There aren't that many of them, we know they're there, but I haven't been able to find anything on fish, the fish they'd be eating. The terrestrial arthropod herbivores, there's not much preserved of them. We've got quite a bit on the tetrapod faunivores that are there. And maybe, possibly, we might have some tetrapod omnivores or kind of high fiber herbivores, but that remains to be investigated a little bit. And one of the reasons that I particularly want to bring in the floral component as a background is because I'm interested in whether that can help us constrain some of the probabilities on what potential omnivory or herbivory might be going on, and in particular, whether it's high fiber or low fiber, because at around this time, we have the earliest members of what go on to, especially the Permian, become really important herbivorous tetrapod lineages. But at this time, it seems that most of them are still producing omnivorous or insectivorous members. And one question arises is, well, are lineages that become high fiber, do they start off as high fiber herbivores, omnivores, and then just continue high fiber herbivores, or do they start off as low fiber herbivores and omnivores, essentially, eating arthropods and the plants that they're crawling on, and then later moving into high fiber herbivory? So, in Atlantic Canada, it seems that late Pennsylvania tetrapods precede late Pennsylvania floras. Herbivorous tetrapod lineages seem to be extremely thin or absent from the city mines formation, as far as I can tell, suggesting possibly that the terrestrial community in city mines formation is still relying on these aquatic resources and still relying on these invertebrate herbivores to provide a resource base for the terrestrial tetrapods. And again, sort of wondering, can the accompanying flora help constrain the probability of herbivory as well as the type of herbivory that's going on? And of course, questions, where are the city mines aquatic vertebrates and the terrestrial herbivorous invertebrates? There's some trackway evidence and some body fossil evidence of the latter, but I haven't been able to find anything on the former, which, again, like I said, opens up some questions about what the aquatic tetrapods that we do have, what they might be eating, and in particular, what we might not be capturing, either due to taphonomy or genuine absence, because there are problems with ecologically modeling things that you don't have preserved, broad questions about imputation and things like that. And with that, I'd like to do my acknowledgments. So a lot of this came out of my PhD at the University of Chicago. So obviously I'd like to thank my thesis committee, lab mates, past and present, museum curators at, lots of different places that were super kind to me, helped me get access to specimens, take photos, collect data, all of that. And of course, funding from the National Science Foundation, University of Chicago, and the Field Museum.